Today we're going to be talking about Anita Augspurg, and she was a suffragist. She was born in Verden an der Aller. She was born on the 22nd of September 1857, and in 1857 there were no rights for girls to have more than a high school education. So for a child who was very intellectual, she was a little bit understimulated. And so her father was a lawyer and he was very involved and interested politically. But there was no opportunities for her to go on to be a lawyer herself, even though she was interested in the trade. So what happened was she finished her high school and then she went on to work at her father's law firm, but kind of just doing menial tasks, which makes sense. If you have no opportunity for women and girls to get any kind of education that would give them the qualifications to become lawyers, they can't really do anything other than just menial tasks because they can't get the qualifications to do more. So she then decided that she was going to study further, but she had to go into studying to become a teacher because that's the only thing that was kind of accepted and that there was a system for. So she did actually qualify as a teacher. However, that didn't really satiate her. But what she did do was that while she was getting her qualification, she started to become an amateur actress. And a lot of resources say that she kind of just, did acting as a hobby or, it wasn't really her passion, but she was really fully engaged and she had a 5-year professional career as an actress, which is pretty impressive. And then when she had done her career in acting, she decided she did want to go to university and get a university qualification and become a lawyer, which meant that she had to have private tutoring because there wasn't a possibility for her to sit the entrance exams to university as a female. Bit of a hurdle to jump over. However, she had a very entrepreneurial mind. So she got her private tutoring and she decided to enroll in university in Zurich in Switzerland, where it was possible for her to get her education and become a qualified lawyer. However, it required having money. And most women at the time couldn't really own property unless they inherited. And she had the good fortune of having a stinking rich maternal grandmother. So when her maternal grandmother died, she inherited, and she was 30, so this was in 1887, and it meant two things. One, that she could afford to go and study and that she could be somewhat financially emancipated in a society where really men held the money, and if you weren't married to a man, you could only have your own money through inheritance. And so she was the fortunate one to do that, and it meant that she could kind of make her own decisions about what she was doing and how she's funding herself and getting private education and going to university. But it also meant that she wasn't dependent on a man to have a household. And that was quite significant for her because she was a lesbian. So if she hadn't had her great-grandmother be stinking rich and then die and then choose to leave all her money to her, it would have meant that she would have had to marry if she couldn't have supported herself financially, which she probably couldn't have because she couldn't get the qualifications to get a job that would have financially supported her. So the fact that her grandma died was excellent. And it also meant that she could have the freedom to then be in society with the women that she might have wanted to date. This becomes quite significant for her politically because she ends up being a bourgeois feminist, and we'll return back to that later. But for now, she's put herself through private tutoring, done the entrance exams, gone to university in Zurich, and got her qualifications. This qualified her as the first woman to get a law doctorate in the whole of the German Empire. When she returned to Germany after having got her qualifications, she came back to Berlin and she was the first. So while she was in Zurich, she did something pretty significant, which would become a co-founder for the Internationale Studentinnenverein, which is the International Female Students Association. And she was doing this alongside Rosa Luxemburg. They had a lot that they agreed on. So they were lefties, they were feminists, they were pacifists, they were against the war, they were co-founding the Internationale Studentinnenverein, and they were also looking at the desire for political change in two different ways. So they both wanted women to be empowered and to have more legal rights, and they both wanted the demolishment of capitalism. However, they looked at it in different perspective. And this is where Anita's bourgeoisie nature and her kind of like upper middle class background plays a role. Because Rosa Luxemburg and Anita Augspurg ended up having a bit of a falling out because Anita was a big proponent of the abolition of the state-regulated prostitution. She felt that the state legislating and regulating prostitution meant that the state was supporting the degradation of female rights through prostitution, because she felt that it was a pillar of patriarchal oppression and that the state was supporting this degradation of female citizens by regulating it and legislating it. However, Rosa Luxemburg felt that the deregulation of prostitution would further incriminate the women who were operating as prostitutes, and that it was a double sacrifice of those women who were functioning in the sex trade, because firstly, it was the accursed property system where women only had their bodies to trade because they couldn't have property and they couldn't have money unless they were, like Anita, incredibly lucky. And so they had to use that economic value to bring in the fiscal sustenance that they required to sustain a society. And if they couldn't have property and they couldn't have money and they couldn't get qualifications for good jobs, then all you got is your body. And then the other side of it is that she also felt that it was the accused moral hypocrisy, where basically the bourgeoisie are the ones saying that, oh, these women are morally degraded and they are criminals for working in the sex trade. But there's also the bourgeoisie who are the clientele of the sex trade. So the clientele of the trade is saying that the trade is immoral and blaming the workers within that trade. That's a hypocrisy. She's right on that front. Even though I think that Rosa and Anita were kind of aiming at the same fundamental end. So making women in the sex trade have rights and be respected in society and have other economic possibilities. They were coming at it from two very different angles. So firstly, Rosa was saying that it should be a bottom-up system of the women in the sex trade and prostitutes in general empowering themselves to create change from the bottom up, and that they didn't need a top-down system to enforce that change upon them. Whereas Anita was saying that there should be a legislatory system that takes away the acceptance of prostitution in order to use the top-down system to pull those women out of prostitution. Both are looking at having economic freedom for the women of the sex trade, but they're just looking at it from very different angles. But this caused a big rupture between the two. What I think is really interesting is that the two are functionally looking at, if you think of it from a totalitarian perspective, like the most happiness for the most amount of people, then you're looking at one, Anita, from the bourgeoisie suffragist background. So she was a feminist fighting for women's suffrage, women's right to vote, women's right to have property, women's right to own their own money and things. She's saying that women's suffrage is the number one most important thing in liberating society. So she's looking at about 51% of society and saying, we need to liberate this lot. And the other, Rosa Luxemburg, is saying, no, we need to focus on the working classes. And so she's saying that women and men of the working classes need to be liberated to help create more freedom and happiness in society. Mathematically speaking, I don't know who's right, because I would say that 51% of the population, i.e. making 51% of the population more liberated and happy by giving them the right to vote and the right to have money and property and all this kind of stuff, would create more value because it's literally 51. But the bourgeoisie, so upper middle class and upper classes, is categorically less numerically of the population. So I'm not quite sure, mathematically speaking, who is looking at a bigger number, because like the working classes are a vast number compared to the bourgeoisie. So and it doesn't give a clear value of who in the middle classes drops into the working classes and who doesn't. So I'm not really sure who's looking at a bigger number, which I find interesting. I do tend to land on Rosa Luxemburg's side when it comes to, if you deregulate prostitution, then it's going to create less safety for people working in that trade. So I kind of support her in the fact that she doesn't support the deregulation of prostitution. But I do see that Anita Augspurg is pushing for something that she believes will liberate women out of a state-legislated violation of women's rights. So I see the two perspectives, but I find it very interesting to think about who is mathematically looking at a higher value of happiness in society out of the populace. Don't know. The other thing that was really positive about her grandmother leaving her a hell of a lot of inheritance in 1887 was that Anita was then able to open up a photography studio with her friend Sophia, which is really cute. And it was called the Hof Atelier Elvira. And there's a lot of very cute photos of gatherings of suffragists together having very happy times in that photo studio, which I think is so sweet. And in 1893, she actually set up a school, a grammar school in Karlsruhe, specifically so that girls could get their university entrance exams to go to university. Because if you don't pass the entrance exam, you can't go. So there was that massive glass ceiling that she just went with a grammar school in Karlsruhe. Yes, it was only one, but that means that generations of women could then go to university who could not have gone before. So that's pretty damn cool. And then she did something else, which is not to do with education, it's to do with marriage, which is even cooler. There was a thing that happened at the turn of the century in 1900, which was like the civil laws, which was called Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, which meant that for women who got married, they immediately lost property rights to their husband, either their own property that they inherited was handed over to him, or they could not have rights in the property that they lived in. The man of the house, the Hausvater, was the one who owned everything and was all the one who made all the legal decisions. So this thing called Stichentscheid, which is like the husband's final decision, meant that basically the husband could make all the final decisions about property, about money, about what happened in the house. He basically had all the legal rights. And so a woman getting married just forfeited all her legal rights to her husband. This meant that subordination of women was institutionalized. It was a legislation of oppression over women. And the thing that just baffles me beyond that is that if a woman married a foreign man, she immediately lost citizenship. So if I was to live in Germany my whole life and then I married a Frenchman, I would immediately lose my citizenship. Why? I do not understand this. This would mean I couldn't have a pension. I had no rights here. Couldn't vote. In that situation, I wouldn't even have rights to my own property. Like, it just completely eviscerates my independence. It makes me completely politically vulnerable. And she demanded a boycott of these state-supported marriages. She wrote this open letter in 1905 to not only push this boycott, but also to give more public understanding of these other kind of unifications called freie Ehen, which was like a free union, so like a liberated relationship union that wasn't a state marriage. So it kind of functioned in society like a marriage, but it didn't have the legal support from the state. And she wanted to be a proponent of this kind of unification because it didn't mean that you would have to forfeit your property rights as a woman or forfeit all of your rights because your husband could make all the decisions for you, which quite frankly would have been incredibly relevant to her given that she was a lesbian. So I can see why she was very loud about this subject. I would have been too. But what I find really profound about her is that she had liberation. She was liberated by her maternal grandmother. She was part of the bourgeoisie class. She had the money. She had the possession of it. She never got married. She never forfeited anything. She didn't crumble under societal norms because she would have been lonely forever if she didn't marry a man. She was a beautiful, happy lesbian who lived the rest of her life with her partner. And we will talk about that in the second video because they lived such a beautiful existence together, like had their own cars, had their own household, were buried together. It was adorable. But she had the empowerment to liberate herself, to understand her privilege, and to use her privilege to empower others, which is a bold move. She wasn't just saying, oh, I'm going to go and get an education for myself, and then I'm just going to have a nice job for myself and earn good money. No, I'm going to get an education for myself, and then I'm going to use my education to not only enable other girls to go to a school that allows them to sit the entrance exam for university, but I'm also going to create create publications that help women understand laws who haven't had the opportunity to go to a university. And I'm going to use my political self-empowerment to try to change the legal system so that there is a different form of marriage that doesn't mean a woman has to sacrifice all of her rights when she gets married or lose citizenship because she's in a relationship with someone who wasn't happening to be born in the same country. She really utilized her privilege to make positive change. And the fact that she also managed to have such an impact on so many different institutes and found so many associations was just really beautiful. And we will talk about that more in the second episode because she was on the board of the Frauenwohl, which is like female welfare, and then she co-founded the Association of Progressive Women's Clubs. She did so much work in her life. This was a woman who inherited enough to have rested on her laurels for the rest of her life and just been happily in love as an old lesbian. She could have just been a blissful old gay, but she didn't. She really utilized her time on this planet to create positive change, and she worked all the way up until the end of her life. She was tireless about what she was passionate about, and the fact that she was passionate enough to be the first woman in the whole of the German Empire to get a law doctorate and then use it to not only inspire others but to create opportunities for other women is just so cool. And I hope to show in the second episode that she wasn't just doing this incredibly profound work, which she was. She was part of the foundation of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which we will talk about in the second episode, because oh my God, that gathering of women is just like a whole bowl of empowerment. They were amazing. But Anita was also doing this whilst creating beautiful connections with other women and a wonderful, wonderful household with the love of her life. We'll look into that more in the second episode, but for now, if you have the privilege to be well educated, look about means in which you can educate and inspire and empower others, just like she did.